Appreciate Preston leading that song, and it was my suggestion as well that those verses be the ones that we focus on. And what we're going to be doing today then is we're going to be studying our series, I Sought for a Man. Of course, that passage is taken from the prophet Ezekiel, and that saying where God was saying through the prophet, I'm looking for a man, I'm looking for spiritual leadership to influence and move others for good. In Ezekiel's day, God says, sadly, I found no one. But from time to time, there have been, both in biblical record and nowadays, the kind of men that God has looked for. And what I want to do this morning is look to Scripture and maybe spend some of our last months from time to time looking at the models of manhood that we see throughout Scripture. And the reason that we're doing this series, just to remind the congregation here, is there is certainly a lack in so many places of spiritual manhood throughout the world and in our country, and we don't want that to be the case here in our congregation. But as we study this morning, I want to give a couple of comments by way of application. While a lot of what I'll have to say this morning does concern with fatherhood and being an influence in the home, not everything I have to say will impact that. And so certainly there are situations where there are some of us, men, who are not fathers or who are not husbands. And we need to remember that, especially within the Lord's church, we don't ever want to give the impression that manhood in its peak and at its apex is simply a matter of being a husband or being a father. There is spiritual manhood that's within the grasp of those who are not in those positions or roles for whatever set of reasons. But I also want to say by way of application as well, ladies, please don't check out this morning now for a few minutes. We need women, mothers, wives, and the same point applies, just simply women, who will encourage and foster a culture in which spiritual manhood is celebrated and encouraged. And for any woman in here who has children, sons, or grandchildren, grandsons with whom you have any kind of influence, or the ladies that have any kind of impact on the boys here, the young men, teaching them and in other respects, you have a part to play in this matter as well. And the one that I want to look at then as a model of manhood today and to consider with you is Job. Job was a man, the kind of man that God was looking for. And what I want to do is to look at just three different moments in his life, three different times where Job is reflecting upon his life, or there's a record given about his life and what we can learn about spiritual manhood from that. If you go back to Job chapter 1, we learn that in Job's family, he was the spiritual leader. If you go back to Job chapter 1, I want to read the first 5 verses with you. In Job 1 and verse 1, the Bible says, there was a man, and all that word entails. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. What do we learn about this model of manhood? Well, one is his character, as we see in verse 1. There are 4 words or 4 terms that describe really the same characteristic in Job. These 4 words or these 4 terms or phrases in verse 1 all are getting at this central idea, but are synonyms for what that is. The Bible says, first of all, that he was blameless. The idea here is that he was morally complete or whole. Just as a sacrifice or a burnt offering to God was to be complete, whole, without blemish, as far as moral character goes, Job was that kind of man. It also says he was upright. This is being, in terms of spirituality and religion and moral living, he was right. He was correct. He was straight. And it was such straightness that it does not deviate to the left hand or to the right. Meaning the guiding principle of Job's life was not circumstances, was not feel like it, was not I think so. He directed himself by the law of God, and his mindset was, I will not deviate from that to the right or to the left. The Bible also says that he feared God. This is an appreciation of who God is. And he is so moved by godly fear that he would avoid any insult or dishonor given to his God. The mindset that even a life that's led away from the ways of God is an insult to him, and I dare not do that. For whatever else God is in his graciousness, whatever blessings I derive from God, at least one thing I know is that because of my fear of him, I dare not cross him or insult him. This is the mindset that has caution in spiritual activity and refusal to offend the Almighty. But also says that he turned away from evil. Just like someone walking on a path, like on a hike or in the woods, and you see up ahead, there is a 6-foot-long timber rattler. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to walk up to it and pet it? Are you just going to jump over it and see if you can clear it? What you do is, if you don't have the means at your disposal of addressing his presence, and I even use a euphemism there, and you men know what I'm talking about there, you're going to walk all the way around and avoid it, because that's a danger. You don't want to mess with that. This is the approach that Job took to sin. He shunned it. He avoided it. Not just because, I'm afraid and I don't understand it, so I'm going to avoid it. No, he understands what that sin will lead to. There are men who, it seems, take delight in getting as close to the edge as they can. And in some circles, it's a mark of manhood to get to the edge. Job took the approach of, I want to avoid any appearance or threat of contact with sin. To borrow the phrase from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, as Paul said, we want to provide things honorable, not only in the sight of God, but in the eyes of men. And that's part of what shunning evil means, is that I may know I'm doing right, and God clearly knows that I'm doing right, but do others know that I'm avoiding sin and temptation? And I think a lot of us, being humble, would realize that a lot of the battle of dealing with sin is if we will make sure that we're not even doing something that would appear to be evil in the eyes of others. Men here at Jones Road, are we like Job? Could these things be said of me? And it's not what you guys see from me here, and it's not what we might observe in you here, or in the classrooms, or in our other settings. Who are you really? When all the masks and all the appearances are gone and it's just you, alone, going about your work, going about your life, going about your entertainment. Who are you really? This is who Job was really. We need to take it upon ourselves that I don't want to seem to be good only. I want to be good. Well, we also learn about Job in this section is that he was a competent and industrious man. As we see in verse 3, his possessions, measured in livestock, measured agriculturally, mark him off as a very busy, industrious man. See, the man that God looks for takes a serious approach to his work. He has the mindset that I may not be wealthy as far as the world views it, but I will work hard. I will be industrious. I will be busy. I'm going to be a person who takes seriously my work. He wants to be the best at what he does. And Job certainly could not have acquired or maintained this wealth without being this man of competence in industry. But as we learn in verses 2 through 5 about his 7 sons and his 3 daughters, he was involved and active in his family's spiritual life. What we see here is that the 7 brothers would each host, and I think the implication here is on each day of the week, they each had a day in which at one point during the day they would have the entire family over for a meal, including the other brothers and the 3 sisters. This is a family that is harmonious and that delights in each other's company. And the father actually sets the tone, even for adult children who grow up. The father remains that centerpiece, that linchpin of the family and of their family gatherings. And this is a family that's harmonious, that delights to be with one another. We also see that he consecrated his children. As it says in verse 5, so it was when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them. That is to say, that he would seek God's blessings for their spiritual welfare. And I think we go on to see what that looks like, and that is that he would regularly offer burnt offerings, a burnt offering for each one of his children, for all 10 of them. He regularly, routinely offered sacrifices for each of his children out of concern that each one of them would be right with God. This is a man whose constant concern is that he and his family would be clean and acceptable in the eyes of God. What a godly man does is maybe not burn offerings today, but prayer for his family. The role that Job takes here, with no mention of the law of Moses or any kind of indication that he was living under that covenant, as far as we know, there's silence there. He was taking on really the priestly intercessor role for his family. And while certainly a father, a husband, cannot pray so as to have the sins of his family forgiven without their concern or without their think so, certainly the prayer that they would be right with God, that if there were to be sin in my family's life, that they would remedy that they would be right with God. Men, like Job, why don't we pray every day, every morning, that our family would be right with our God, that our children would be safe, protected, not just physically, but spiritually. There are so many threats and so many spiritual predators that are hunting for your child every day. And the older they get, the more serious those predators are, and the less impact you have to protect them from it. Please pray for your children every day. Pray for your wife, that she would be right with the Lord, that she would conduct herself as she ought to, and create this culture within the home where being right with God is the priority. And that's why the 4th verse of the song we sang before the lesson has kind of a new meaning to me after studying Job here. Home is where the altar fires burn and glow. What do you think that means? An altar is for sacrifice. An altar means worship. Job kept the altar fires burning for his family. And so ought we to have homes where God and concern for what God thinks about us is at the forefront of our minds. Something else we learn about Job in this book is how he endured and faced tragedy. We read in chapter 1, verses 20 through 22 about his financial disaster and his personal grief. After he has lost all of his wealth, his livelihood, and as it also says, if you'll go down to verse 18, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Such, I would say, unimaginable loss. And yet, we are in a room that has people, men and women, who have suffered financial loss or hardship. They've had to work at it. And people who've had to bury children. And for those who have not, you have no guarantee that that won't be your reality tomorrow. None of us. What's a godly man to do? What is the godly to react? In verse 20, then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. We later learned that even his own health and wellness was taken away. Here was a man who was reduced to being alone except for his wife, who was a spiritual liability now. And he was sitting with shaved head, boils and sores from head to foot, and his only relief was scraping and relieving the pressure of those sores with a potsherd. It is truly a low time in one's life when lancing wounds with a potsherd is our only relief. In verse 9 of chapter 2, his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. As she suggests, that's one spiritual boil that you might as well go ahead and lance. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job appreciated the fact that God gives, and God sometimes allows what is given to be taken away, and that God is still to be praised. Many blame God and hold grudges against Him for the disasters that come up in our lives. But Job praised God even amid grief and even amid sorrow and loss. Job took the mindset that he does not have the right to withhold worship and obedience to God just because life is painful. Job did express grief, tore his robe, he shaved his head. He exhibited the signs that society acknowledges and that his own soul cried out to as grief, but he was not controlled, defined, and directed by his tragedy. As men, as children of God in general, but I'm talking to the men especially today. Financial ruin, job loss, and the accompanying hits to one's dignity and self-esteem that those carry. Family grief, and watching your body and your mind begin to fail you when you cannot physically do the things that you used to do. And you know that that reversal and that decline is irreversible. These are moments that you need to show to God and to others and to show to yourself. God does not have to pay me for my allegiance to Him. He does not have to pay me with physical bliss in order to serve Him. He owns me. He commands my grateful allegiance regardless of the circumstances of my life. And what an impact this godliness has on others if God can seek out and find men among us like that. And I can say that I'm thankful for the men in our congregation who are and have been a model in this regard as well. I want to go then to a third and final area that we learn from Job and how he is a model of manhood that God has set forth for us. I want to go over with you to chapter 29 of Job. In this section, these are Job's last words in this section, of which chapter 29 is a part, before God comes to him and says, Job, get ready. I'm going to answer or ask you some questions. Answer me if you can. This is his last outpouring of defense of his character and who he had been. And even though these are coming from Job's words, as the saying goes, is it boasting if it's true? Here is a man who is not bragging. He is simply stating as a matter of fact, as a matter of historical record, the kind of man that he had been. And there's so much for us men to learn from what Job says here, both in chapter 29 and then what we're about to see in chapter 31. That Job was a man in the community and at home. In chapter 29, I'd like to read a few verses here with you throughout this chapter. And the picture that we're getting here is that here is a man who in his community, in his business dealings, in his civic responsibilities, he had a reputation that was defined by justice, by wisdom, by the impact and the influence that he had on others. Go over in chapter 29 with me and look down to verse 3. Just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me, when my steps were bathed with cream and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. I think the image he uses there is what often is used today as referred to as the Midas touch. You know, that person at work or that person in politics or that person in business, we say that everything they touch turns to gold. Job is saying here, there was that time when it seemed like everything I was doing, God was making to prosper. And now he takes us through a tour down memory lane of what that looked like in his role in the community. In verse 7, when I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square. See, the gate of the city, as you would approach a city in ancient times, there would be almost like a courtyard plaza-like area in front of the gate and in the gate area. And this is often where simply business and commerce, deals struck, negotiations, and where the elders of the village or the city would come and they would carry on the community's business. That's the gate, that's the area that Job is talking about. So he says in verse 8, when I went there, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged arose and stood. The young men saw me and fled. What does that mean? Have you ever been in a situation where you saw your boss coming or you see a teacher coming and you kind of like look the other way or kind of made yourself scarce? The mindset there is, here's a person in whom, in my eyes, I hold them in such esteem and respect that there's that kind of reverence for them, almost an intimidation factor. Job says the young men were intimidated by my standing in the community, but the aged men arose and stood as a sign of honor and respect for who Job was. Be the kind of man that, not by public show, but by inner private character, is such that even the elderly look at and they appreciate. In verse 9, the princes or the rulers refrained from talking and put their hand on their mouth. The voice of nobles was hushed and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw, then it approved me. Because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless and the one who had no helper. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. Job says the reason why people, when they heard my voice speak, loved it, and the reason when they saw me, they were thankful for me, is they knew what I was doing to help those who couldn't help themselves. And they blessed God for it. And so he said in verse 14, I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor. And I searched out the case that I did not know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. And go on down to verse 21. Men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. After my words they did not speak again, and my speech settled on them as dew. They waited for me as for the rain, and they open their mouth wide as for the spring rain. If I mocked at them, or the idea there is, if they somehow saw the smile of Job, they did not believe it, and the light of my countenance they did not cast down. What he's saying there is, no matter how I was, no matter how they were, I was rock steady, I was consistent. In verse 25, I chose the way for them and sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts mourners. What Job is reflecting on here give us valuable lessons and standards to strive for. Become a man worthy of these kinds of reactions, earning them through consistent focus on character in private, always doing the right thing, and thereby earning the esteem of your fellow man in favor with God. Maybe another way to put it is, if salt is not used, it has no purpose. The measure of a man is his impact upon other people for good. And you can know everything, you can have experienced everything, you could have been there and done everything, but if you don't take that and channel it to make other people better and to help others strive to become better than what they are, what is it for? Job used who he was to help others acquire the qualities of righteousness and of goodness. But we also see in chapter 31, if you'll turn there with me, his character at home. His character at home was defined in this way. Number one, he refused to allow lust to contaminate the home. In chapter 31, in verse 1, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above, the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? God knows how many steps you took yesterday, and he knows where they were. Job goes on to say in verse 9, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door. Verse 10 is very explicit with its euphemism. Then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. That is to say, if he had done that, that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity, deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. Men, lust, whether it's held before your eyes or whether it's entertained in your mind alone, and certainly if that is beginning to be expressed towards someone who's not your spouse, you are contaminating, you are polluting, you are defiling. Not just your mind, not just your relationship with God. You are contaminating your home. There was a good brother in Christ years ago who spent a lot of time teaching the Bible classes when I was a very young guy. And one of the things he said was at work, there were some of the guys that were passing around pictures that were lewd and designed to excite lust, and they were passing it around as if this were some token of manhood. And he went ahead and shared, not to brag, but he was trying to teach us, young people, something. He said, I told the other guys, you realize that is just like cheating on your wife. He was absolutely right. To hold a mental picture in my mind even of lust and evil desire, that is cheating on your wife. It is cheating on your family. And I understand that in terms of the actual act and its consequences for divorce and that sort of thing, that's a study for another time. I'm not equating them. They are separate. But does that undo the terrible wickedness and transgression against God in the home that lust and evil desire is? Job said, I've made a deal. I've signed a contract with my eyes. Job refused to allow lust or unfaithfulness to contaminate the home. But also we learn, verses 5 through 8, that in all of his dealings, business and otherwise, he was an honest man. In verse 5 he says, if I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity, if my step has turned from the way, or my heart has walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands. Then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. This means that it's not just that Job was honest in his business dealings in terms of weights and measures and giving his word, giving an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. But it means that his word can be counted on. Not just that he was honest, but he was dependable in his word. Just as an observation, younger generations today really struggle with dependability. To be able to say, okay, that's the plan, I will be there. And then you can count on them being there. Not, I'll be there unless a better deal comes up of spending my time. Or unless I feel like breaking my word at the last minute and not being there or coming through to help you. But just being a person of your word, even if it comes around to hurt you and to be an extreme inconvenience, keep your word. It needs to be something that others, once you have spoken, it can be depended upon. It can be counted upon. But it also means that he is an honest and trustworthy man with his family in the home. One of the greatest hurts that a man can give his wife and children is not just not being there and being present and available, but not being dependable, not being a person of his word. If promises and words are given to the wife and to the children, keep them. And if you've made a mistake and you've spoken unwisely and you've overcommitted, unless it involves some kind of sin, put yourself out and learn some wisdom the next time if that's needed to be the kind of man that you need to be. A mark of godly manhood is that your word is as true as could be and rock solid. And someone knows that if something came up there where you didn't keep your word, or you weren't dependable, you didn't follow through on it, there must have been some kind of almighty obstacle that was superhuman that kept you back from it. But if you go over with me to verses 13 and through 23, we see an echo of what he had said earlier, and that he cared for the helpless. In verse 13, he says, if I have despised the cause of my male or female servant, when they complain against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? If I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat of it, but from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fall from my shoulder. Let my arm be torn from the socket. For destruction from God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. Going down to verse 29. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him, indeed, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. If the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. Do you see what Job is saying here? His track record is, when there were the helpless, when I observed the poor, when I sought out the lonely, even if they had been my enemies, I provided for them. A mark and a token of godly manhood is that a man so works and so orders his affairs that after he has given back to his God, after he has provided for his own, he so orders his affairs that he ensures that as God's blessing affords, he has enough to provide for others, to care for them, to show hospitality for them, to meet needs that might arise. It is an act of selfishness to so budget one's time and money and resources so that there is never, ever anything when there's a need that arises. But also, and in line of that, and maybe because of this fact, he had a balanced attitude toward his wealth. In verse 24, Job says, "If I've made gold my hope, or said to fine gold, you are my confidence. If I've rejoiced because my wealth was great and because my hand had gained much." Or verse 38, "If my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I've eaten its fruit without money or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat and weeds instead of barley." What we would say today for modern men is not so much for gold or silver, but it's for the job that provides for me. Here's a responsible, balanced attitude toward his possessions and his wealth. We see here in Job, model of a godly man. Here are Job's characteristics that are a matter of historical record. He was industrious. Would anyone ever think to apply that label to you or to me? If I fritter away my time just only fishing, only watching sports on Saturdays, playing video games all afternoon and evening, all weekend, if I'm just squandering my time with these things, I'm not like Job, and I won't be a man like him. There's a time for restoration and refreshment and rest. But there's a difference between using moments to refresh oneself and getting back to it and making recreation a consuming activity for you. Job was serious. He was a man that when needs and counsel were sought and discussed in the community, he sought through them. There are some men I know that on every serious occasion, every moment of import, they have nothing but wits and jokes, and they cannot take anything seriously. And that's probably a kind of coping mechanism they have when they don't feel like they can meet an occasion. But that's not the kind of man that Job was. He took life and life's needs and life's questions and challenges deadly seriously. He was impactful. Job's presence was felt, not because he was a grandstander or called attention to himself. He worked hard and he was the kind of man of character. And men of character are always sought out. They're always needed. There's always a need for them. There's always a call for them and a demand for them because they are so scarce. He was observant and compassionate. He could not have helped the widow or the orphan or the helpless if he did not keep his eye out for such people. I wonder if sometimes our reluctance to share and to give and to help the needy, as we often raise the excuse, well, I don't see them. Job saw them. He found them. And they are out there. We need to pick our heads up, men, and find them. He was spiritual. He was a spiritual being. And he conducted himself and treated others as he were a spiritual being. He was conscientious of his responsibilities to God and the calls that others had upon his time and his energy and his resources. And he was aware of that. Here is the transition from childhood and boyhood to manhood, is the transition from selfishness to giving, to being the kind of person that requires for survival and for thriving and for satisfaction others to give to me. Godly manhood, as we see from Job and other examples, is that disposition that my survival and my thriving is only to be found in giving to others and impacting them for good. God looked for a man, and he found one in Job. Here's a man who was too busy and serious about the responsibilities of life and of spiritual needs. That he was not given to frivolity or wastefulness of time. He was the kind of man who works, controls himself, observant to the needs of others. And because of those qualities, he was a refreshing, reassuring presence to everyone around him. And when tragedy struck, and others failed him, others left him, the qualities that made him who he was with God's blessings before were the same qualities that made him honorable in the eyes of God, such that he was a man that God bragged to the devil about him. And he stood up to the challenge. Am I useful to God and to others? I make that choice. The circumstances of my life, the fortunes of as others might see it externally to my life, they will change with the passing years. What I hold and treasure in my character, in my soul, is something that only my God and I need to worry about, and what we can control. And so we're calling upon men to be like Job, and to be those men that God can use and impact for good. We thank you for listening this morning, and we invite you, that men especially, that anyone here, if you realize you haven't been the kind of person that you ought to be, the kind of person at home that you ought to be, the kind of person in the congregation that God would have you be, and you wish to confess and to receive the encouragement and the prayers of this congregation, we invite you. And certainly, by all means, if you want to become a child of God, and no matter what life throws at you, no matter what the challenges of sin and temptation might give you, that you can face it with God at your side, we encourage you to come as well in any kind of capacity that we can help you while we stand and while we sing a song of encouragement.